Welcome back to the fall 2021 version of the MIT Open Documentary Lab and Co-Creation Studio lecture series, public talk lecture series. We have a really exciting lineup this season. And this season, we're virtually from around the world, but we're also in person on campus. So we're trying a new hybrid model. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker who's going to launch our series, Vanessa Chang. But before we get to Vanessa, just a little bit of housekeeping. My name is Kat Cizek, and I'm the artistic director of the Co-Creation Studio here at the lab. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm a white woman, and I've got my hair tied up in a bun at the top, and I'm wearing a big smile. I'm coming to you from Toronto, Canada. Which is situated on the treaty land and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe. The land is part of the territory protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. On behalf of my colleagues, Lab Principal Investigator William Uricchio and Lab Director Sarah Wallazin, we are really grateful to our funders, John A. MacArthur Foundation and Just Films at Ford Foundation for supporting us with these talks and also all our initiatives. Welcome to everyone who's joining from around the world. We will be opening up after Vanessa's talk to your questions, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box. Claudia Romano, the producer at ODL, is posting in the chat a longer bio for Vanessa, but it's my honor to let you know that Vanessa Chang is a curator, writer, and educator who builds communities and conversations about art, technology, and human bodies. She is a senior program manager at Leonardo, and she holds a Ph.D. in modern thought and literature from Stanford University and teaches in visual and critical studies at California College of the Arts. Today, Vanessa is speaking about building regenerative media art ecologies. We're really thrilled to have you here, Vanessa.
Thank you, Kat, for the generous introduction. So yes, as Kat said, I'm Vanessa Chang. I use she, her, they pronouns. I'm an Asian and white woman with shoulder-length dark hair, a white and black top, bright multicolored beaded necklace, and my virtual background is of a carved graffiti sculpture that says tempt with a brightly colored graffiti backdrop. Today, I'm calling in from Yelamu, the unceded territories of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, otherwise known as San Francisco, California. So I'm delighted to join you all. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen here. So today I'd like to talk about a few strands in my research and my practice that interlace around art and technology. First, I'll discuss the idea that technologies are not inert objects, but rather that they embody social, cultural, and ideological systems, and also that they act upon us in crucial ways. I'll then discuss media art and technology practice as a lab for exploring these ideas, particularly in our contemporary context when so many technologies we use emerge out of extractive capitalism. I'll situate this work within the larger context of the field, particularly in research and development initiatives, residencies, and other spaces, and talk about the need for non-extractive, regenerative paradigms to support the development of media art ecosystems. Turning towards the genesis and development of Cryptek Incubator, an initiative I'm working on at Leonardo, the International Society for the Arts, Science, and Technology. So I'm going to talk about technology quite expansively in a way that encompasses design, architecture, engineering, and digital technology as a material expression and exercise of the human will on our world. And I'd like to start with the mundane stairs. So stairs. Stairs embody ideas about who is going to use them. Stairs are built for someone who can walk, who is of certain size and fitness, whose legs are long enough to ascend the height of each individual step. For a wheelchair user, stairs deny access to a space. Stairs are one technique of design that we use to act upon and shape our environments. At the same time, they organize bodies in space. If you can use the stairs, you get to go where they reach. If you can't, you don't. They can ascend straight up, coil beautifully into a tight space, curve grandly from a parlor to a mezzanine. The design of stairs as aesthetic and functional objects are determined by architectural conventions, creative choice, as well as building codes. Deceptively simple, many ideas, acts, and people cohere in stairs. Here I'd like to compare stairs to the speed bump, which is an example used by the French philosopher Bruno Latour to explain how technological artifacts are not inert. The speed bump is colloquially known in some cases as a sleeping policeman, but we can take the name seriously. What does a speed bump do? What happens when you reach a speed bump? You slow down. And if you don't, you feel the impact of your decision, sometimes quite greatly. Who decides where a speed bump goes? Why is a speed bump here and not there? Who builds the speed bump? What is involved in the process of putting it there? As Latour says, the speed bump is not made of matter. Ultimately, it is full of engineers and chancellors and lawmakers commingling their wills and their storylines with those of gravel, concrete, paint, and standard calculations. So these objects are not just made of matter, but mediators, actions, and laws. And behind every artifact, there are numerous mediators, whether designers, engineers, lawyers, corporations, which make technical objects, but also human beings, what Latour calls object institutions. So technologies are not just objects. They express social, cultural, and political ideas. At the same time, they are also architectures that organize our bodies in space and time. Placed in public space and traversed by many, a speed bump slows you down, or it's meant to. Or another example. It's been a while since I've done this, thanks to the pandemic, but I used to spend a lot of time working on my laptop at cafes. Looking around occasionally when I looked up, I would see most people hunched over their laptops, brows furrowed, lips pursed, just like me. It was like this shared coda of movement we all had, but didn't know and to consciously perform. So technologies are ideological. They're designed for particular bodies and minds. They express ideas. They are material philosophies. These simple examples may not immediately conjure an association with technology because they're not high tech. But I start with them to get us thinking about more advanced technologies that are increasingly common in everyday life and, for our purposes, increasingly used in media art. And also to invite you to conceive of technologies as fundamentally social and networked. So what does all of this have to do with media art and with media art ecologies? Well, I'd like to use a few contemporary works in art and technology, both to unpack what I mean here and to highlight how media art can be a stage for examining and remaking these ideas. So let's look at two examples from the artist Stephanie Dinkins that highlight two distinct approaches to using advanced technology in media art. So Conversations with Bina 48 is a video series wherein Dinkins stages a series of recorded interactions with a social robot from Hanson Robotics, Bina 48, which is an acronym for Breakthrough Intelligence via Neural Architecture, 48 exaflops a second. As you can see in this image, there are two heads in profile. At first glance, two Black women in matching t-shirts and colorful scarves mirror each other. As you watch the videos, which are often organized in a gallery space as a series of four in a square, eventually, as the conversation unfolds, the robot's kind of twitchy gestures and stilted speech really reveal its uncanny nature, which is in stark contrast with Dinkins. If you've seen the robot Sophia, another of Hanson Robotics' works, then you would get a sense of what that looks like. So as they chat, and the conversation has been ongoing, they range a lot of different topics: family, race, faith, robot civil rights, love, relationships. They are absurd, sometimes oddly profound, and sometimes moving, but usually uncanny. So although Bina was modeled on a living Black woman, Bina Aspen Rothblatt, Bina 48's programming really omits any understanding of this racial identity or history. As Dinkins notes on her website, at their first meeting, she asked Bina 48, "Who are your people?" alongside questions about race, love, and relationships. But Bina 48 preferred to talk about singularity and consciousness, which I guess are pretty hot topics in among AI and robots. Through this contrast and this kind of performance, Dinkins really exposes the exclusionary mechanisms encoded in automation and AI, and the largely homogeneous industry that produces and disseminates this technology globally. In their foundational work on algorithmic bias, scholars like Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin have examined how these forms of bias are produced by the racist conjunction of code, the big and often flawed data from which these technologies are built, and the social, cultural, and political histories from whence they emerge, to very quickly sum important bodies of work. Dinkins, however, has another work that really offers an interesting contrast here. So this is two or not the only one. Here presented as a sculpture that people can move around and interact with in a gallery space. Not the only one includes a bespoke artificial intelligence, which Dinkins coded herself. And she presents this AI as designed by, with, and for Black women who have long been underrepresented in the technology sector. So quite differently from a lot of the AI that we see commercially, and two is trained with small data. So oral histories from 3 generations of women in a single family. It is a highly specific and highly culturally specific curative to systemic racial bias in AI. So these 2 projects, both of which are created by Stephanie Dinkins, really embody distinct artistic approaches to creative technology. So in the first, Dinkins worked with a finished commercial product by Hanson Robotics. In 2, she works outside of this corporate paradigm, using open source software to build the system herself in consultation with the community it represents. It's a much tighter sphere of creation. I use these 2 examples to highlight the thorny relationship between contemporary art and technology practice and capital. So a lot of the contemporary technologies used by media artists, like virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, and game engines, originate in an industry whose products replicate systemic inequalities in many ways and at many tiers of influence, whether that's in their product, in their hiring practices, and so on. Like the stairs and the speed bump, these technologies are not just inert artifacts. They embody particular beliefs and structure our lived experiences in lots of ways, like machine learning and image recognition in Google Images. Years ago, Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, they discussed what, is grounded in her response to doing Google image searches on Black girls and being very troubled by what happened there. So artists like Dinkins might stage blistering critiques of these technologies and the systems of production that beget them. Or artists might render playful artworks that invite new forms of contemplation for spectators. Consider game engines like the incredibly popular Unity. So game engines are software development environments built for video game designers and are increasingly used as a creative medium. Unity is a commercial game engine used in all scales of video game development, from the large studio to the hobbyist bedroom. It facilitates particular production workflows, design methodologies, and software literacies, and embodies in this way the increasingly dominant roles of particular tools in cultural production. So it enables amateurs and professionals both not only to build content for platforms, but also lock in industry ideologies in the ideation, production, implementation, and distribution of digital creative work. So in this respect, Unity might be understood as another frontier in platform capitalism, what some scholars have called the platformization of cultural production. Platform capitalism describes a business model in which hardware and software are used as a foundation or platform for other actors to conduct their business. The most obvious examples being Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and others. Unity has increasingly been used by media artists to make work. For example, media artist Ian Cheng has long used Unity as a core technology in his work. In his Emissaries trilogy, here's a screenshot from Emissary and the Squad of Gods from 2015. which has been acquired by MoMA, spectators are asked to witness a parallel reality that is programmed to perpetually develop its own narratives. It's basically a video game that plays itself. So in this simulation, which is sometimes shown at life-size scale in a gallery, visitors are confronted by the uncanny agency and power of such systems and their capacity to render a world without the need for human participation. And of course, there are other ways the relationship between art and technology practice and capital is fraught. Last year, I led a research study commissioned by The Grid, a global network connecting artists, technologies, cultural institutes, policymakers, and tech companies, and animated by the goal of incorporating art thinking into the development of new technologies. In this study, I found that funding and innovation in the sphere of art and technology practice in the US is animated in many ways by hype cycles and by corporate interests. So because media artists can create new insight into how emerging technologies work and what they can do, generating new use cases for a technology, they can offer compelling reasons to invest in artists and cultural institutions. So this support has ebbed and flowed in the United States following the peaks and troughs of capital. The last decade alone has seen great buzz around 3D printing, VR, AI, and now AR. AI and VR are several hype cycles along if we consider the last few decades. So each of these moments has seen a bunch of investment and artistic innovation, and then sometimes a drought. They follow what IT research and advisory firm Gartner calls the hype cycle, which is a graphic representation of the generalized emergence, maturity, and adoption of specific technologies. So if you look at these 5 key phases here, you can see the life cycle of a technology from its invention or the technology trigger, steps into the marketplace, and failures. And I'm deeply amused by the titles of the movements through this space. As you can peak of inflated expectations, trough of disillusionment, the slope of enlightenment, and finally the plateau of productivity, where a technology finds widespread adoption if it finds broad traction. So in doing this study, a number of leaders at cultural institutions like New Ink, Gray Area, and Serpentine Galleries told me artists and cultural institutions tend to engage at the very end of this cycle, at the plateau of productivity, when the product decisions have already been made. But, and this is where a number of contemporary research and development initiatives are trying to situate themselves, because of the technical proficiency needed to use tools creatively, artists have the potential to reshape the trajectory of a technology and do in fact have a history of doing so. So there are a number of R&D initiatives in this respect. In Europe, we've got the long-running Ars Electronica Future Lab, ZKM's Hertz Lab in Germany, Serpentine Galleries R&D platform in the UK. And in the US, there's been an incredible renaissance of the art technology lab across art academia and industry, now numbering over 100. These include spaces like UT Dallas's School of the Arts, Technology, and Emerging Communication, San Jose State University's Cadre Lab, LA County Museum of Art and Technology program, Google's Artist and Machine Intelligence program, ThoughtWorks Arts, and the Berggruen Institute Transformation of the Human program, which places artist philosopher teams at R&D labs in tech firms, and whose founder Tobias Rees describes technological design as applied philosophy, returning to the discussion with which I opened this talk. So according to scholars John Beck and Ryan Bishop, who recently published Technocrats of the Imagination, these efforts are grounded in mid-20th century collaborations between artists and Cold War military industrial institutions. So the lineage they identify here is in Bell Labs, Experiments in Art and Technology program, LACMA's Art and Technology Lab, and MIT's own CAVS program. So Beck and Bishop, however, suggest that these early models of collaborative, project-based, time-limited, interdisciplinary activity serve as templates for a number of these 21st century initiatives, but that a number of these initiatives are trying to reproduce these templates without the utopian political visions of the 1960s, and that without that, we risk innovation and, well, spectacle without innovation and without a kind of political commitment. Also built on the tenuous labor of artists, many of these efforts, particularly in technology firms, can operate within the logic of extractive capitalism. So in several of these contexts, artistic labor is understood as fuel for innovation. But for many artists, this has proven unsustainable. So there was a recent spreadsheet, I think it was circulating end of last year, among media artists, and invited them to list if their work had informed corporate development and innovation, and if it had in fact been credited and or compensated. The mix was wide. There was innovation among a number of different contexts. Some had been credited and compensated, but a significant number hadn't been. I mean, I've spoken to many amazing advocates in corporate art and technology programs. In some cases, there really is a free space to support artistic practice without the quid pro quo, but often they are animated by a higher impetus up the ladder to meet return on investment. So it's a really sticky landscape, particularly in the United States, to navigate. So stacked, I think the creative field of media art and technology really needs regenerative and renewing approaches to sustain the field as we look towards the future. So at this point, I'd like to pivot into discussing how my research in this space has informed some of my own work at Leonardo and how we're striving to build one regenerative, community-centered media art ecology. So first, I'll return to the example of the stairs and the ramp. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, stairs can foreclose access to certain bodies. So this is a curb cut, which I guess you could think of as a tiny little ramp. So the ramp, which is an architectural and design object, is for many a symbol of disability activism, as it allows wheelchair users access to spaces they could not otherwise go. So the curb cut, as seen here in the bottom right corner, was also an act of community agency. In Berkeley in the 1960s, which was this incredible hub of disability activism, activists used sledgehammers to smash curb cuts into the curb for wheelchair users, so they don't be forced to navigate the hazards of a road shared with cars. I want to use this trope as a gateway for talking about accessibility in a few different ways. Accessibility not just as accommodation or compliance, but as design justice, and as a creative practice that can serve as the basis for one regenerative media art ecology. So last year, sure feels like a lifetime ago at this stage, I co-curated an exhibition with my fabulous and longtime collaborator, Lindsay Dolich-Felt. I was working on art and technology shows in San Francisco with an exhibition and curatorial background that emerged out of and was informed by my scholarship. And I realized that there was this gap in how we talk about art and technology. And it was just part of an ongoing conversation Lindsay and I had been having since we met in grad school at Stanford. While researching media and technology, I realized that the history of technology is a history of disability. So whether that's low tech, I imagine a number of you have used the OXO peeler with the Good Grips handles. It's this rubbery handle for a peeler that gives you a lot more traction on peeling. It was developed by Sam Farber when he saw his wife struggling to use a peeler with her arthritis. Or in a more high-tech sense, you could say that the entire basis of the internet is built around deafness. For example, Ken Harenstein, who's a deaf software engineer, helped to develop DefNet in the 1970s, and in which he attempted to link people with teletypewriters to ARPANET and later the internet. Harenstein would later go on to Google to lead the development of automatic captioning at YouTube, which launched in 2009, contributing to greater accessibility on the web. To cite but a few examples of how the history of disability has contoured the history of technology. Knowing that and collaborating with Lindsay and building on her longstanding research interests in how disabled people hack and remake technologies for their own ends, sometimes to make them more usable, but also as a mode of creative resistance, we wanted to explore how access fundamentally informs how disabled body minds fit, or often don't, in this world that we build. So when we saw a curatorial call for curatorial proposals at SOMArts, which is a truly wonderful cultural center in San Francisco, we saw an opportunity to cultivate a creative space to explore these ideas. So in this image, you'll see an overhead view of opening night at SOMArts of Recoding CripTech, our show. And we wanted to build not only on the art and technology ecosystem in the San Francisco Bay Area, but also a history of disability activism and to address a generative intersection between the two. We wanted to foster new dialogues about disability's role in technological design and art, reframing the vibrant history of disability activism in the Bay Area within the broader movement of technological innovation in Silicon Valley. We wanted to challenge prevailing ableist narratives that technology serves to normalize, cure, or rehabilitate disability, and that artists and disability justice advocates take playful, transgressive, and critical approaches to reimagine this cultural history. A note here about the title of the show and about the incubator, which I will discuss shortly. CripTech draws on the work of several major figures in the field of disability scholarship, notably Amy Amre's and Kelly Fritsch's Crip Technoscience Manifesto, whereby they name practices of critique, alteration, and reinvention of the material and discursive world as a ground for social justice and remaking the world with a commitment to disability as a difference that matters. Importantly, the term, like our approach to the show, is about how disabled people are experts and designers. Through this project, we wanted to highlight not only the work of Crip Technoscience, and not only in everyday life, but also in media art practice. We drew too on someone who is now a partner in the incubator, Karen Nakamura, who's a professor at Berkeley and the chair of the Disability Studies Cluster, and who had run conferences on CripTech before. So let's get into talking about what we mean when we talk about that. So this is one work that highlights this approach to cripping media art and cripping art and technology. So this is a large ramp at its 24 feet by 15 feet by 6 feet at its peak that was created for a wheelchair dance performance descent by kinetic light. While ramps are usually understood as accommodation, think to the curb cut that I showed you a little earlier, this was a performance space for some virtuosic choreography. Two wheelchair dancers danced and spun and moved all around this ramp and used this space in really extraordinary ways. So this is a photograph of the ramp as it was staged in the original performance. There is a glowing purple backdrop with constellations of stars and a downward sloping ramp that curls up at the right edge, which is lit to resemble a rippling pool of water. So the ramp began as accessible design for disability communities, but this installation transcends function and embraces play, aesthetics, contradiction, and a new way of moving and being in the world. This is an example of disability-led innovation that is about dismantling and remaking technologies by, with, and for disabled people, which is one of the core motivations behind CripTech. CripTech is not the idea that technology is about curing or fixing disability, but rather to showcasing ways that disabled people live with and repurpose technologies for their own individual and community needs. As we worked on the show, we sought to meet accessibility standards like captioning for videos, audio description for artworks, and tactile images. We wanted to challenge the idea of galleries as a predominantly visual space where you couldn't touch things. So this on the left here is a 3D print of the ramp. And as you can see, it says, please feel free to touch. On the right, this is a design for a tactile image. Its title is rendered in Braille on the top, and the image itself was printed in a textured pattern. I could go into a lot about printing the tactile images. It's a really interesting space, and turns out you can't just directly translate images to tactility. It's really quite complicated. So as we developed accessibility for the show, we came to be guided by the creative paradigms of access and the channels it opened for multi-sensory aesthetic experience. This work foregrounded the significance of aesthetic access to us, the idea that commitment to access as a creative principle could foster really generative artistic experiences that go far beyond accommodation. As the artist Yinka Shonibare has said, the disabled avant-garde are the last avant-garde. Here's another example. So this is The Foot Knows the Foot When It Touches the Earth by the artist Jennifer Justice, which premiered at our show. In this image, taken from the opening night of Recoding CripTech, Georgina Klieg and her friend touch and feel Jennifer Justice's interactive installation, which are 3 columns of stacked pallets topped by a surface of multicolored moss, dirt, and 3D printed animal footprints. The tactile transducers, those black discs on the top, are transmitting vibrations and sound from a playlist that includes clog dancing and animal stampedes. Jennifer is a blind artist who committed to making a multimedia haptic installation from the outset that invited visitors to touch her work. Access makes possible these forms of engagement. And her work really truly embodies what it means to build in access as a creative practice. It underwent many iterations from conception to implementation and involved in conversation with many folks and with us. She was incredibly generous in the way she co-designed this piece with the disability community to try and design around access concerns and really integrate that into the aesthetics of the piece. So this was part of our larger work in the exhibition around accessibility. And as we were developing it, we felt like there was an urgent need to develop this discourse in the field of media art, and so much promise too with the multisensory capacity of media art. So we started with this idea to develop an artist residency. But as we began to develop the project at Leonardo, we wanted the entire project not just to embody disability aesthetics, but a crip politics as well. One of interdependence and mutual care, whose very structure embodied access. This brings us to Cryptek Incubator. Cryptek Incubator centers disability innovation and creates a platform for disabled artists to remake creative technologies through the lens of access. Within disability culture, the term CRIP recognizes disability as a cultural and political identity, and it actively resists and challenges the medicalized discourse of disability as deficit or pathology. The CRIP as a term has a fraught history of oppression. It has been reclaimed by activists and scholars like Amy Amrei, Kelly Fritsch, and activists online like Alice Wong. So we're really intentional in our use of CRIP in this project as it reflects our core commitments and values. Firstly, it names and centers the disability community as a noun, while simultaneously functioning as a verb that describes the ongoing work of resistance and disability justice. And 2, it informs the community framework of care and mutual aid we seek to cultivate. In art and technology spaces, engagement with disability culture has been limited to thinking about accommodation or accessibility as a form of compliance. But with Cryptek Incubator, we align with disability culture's reimagining of access as an experimental process whereby makers and artists crip or hack technologies, not just for the purpose of accessibility, but also to build new aesthetic engagements and paradigms. Cripping new media engenders groundbreaking forms of representation, storytelling, and world building. Cryptek Incubator utilizes Leonardo's full cycle creative engine, remaking the entire design cycle through the lens of access. Through this life cycle, we're supporting the whole cycle of an artistic idea from conception through dissemination, encompassing residencies, workshops, talks, publication, exhibition. With the support of the California Arts Council and a number of our amazing partners, we've dedicated this whole year to building a regenerative ecology for the project. We've drawn together people from different sectors in the media arts and technology sector. Residencies include academic institutions, UC Berkeley and the Berkeley Disability Lab, Beal Center for Art and Technology at UC Irvine, industry through ThoughtWorks Arts Residency, and a private residency site Santa Barbara Center for Art, Science, and Technology. We're also working with Arizona State University on exhibition and education outcomes. And we'll be publishing work with Leonardo as well as with Groundworks, a platform for archiving and documenting the project through A2RU, the Alliance of Research Universities. So through this full cycle model, we're working towards a relational model grounded on disability politics, an ecology with meaningful connections between partners. We're gathering people from various disability communities from across sectors, residency sites, academic, and otherwise. We're working to bring an intersectional lens to the project, and I'm working to ensuring representation and a commitment to a disability politics of access and care at each layer of the project. From the project design and development team, representation in residency communities, our jury, the communities we're consulting, and our artist cohort. Every day, we strive to learn, grow, and do better in serving and reflecting this community. And every day, there is a lot to learn. In terms of the framework of extractive versus regenerative ecologies I discussed earlier, in Cryptek Incubator, we understand access as design justice. Ableism is an expression of and product of capitalism. Capitalist systems promote ableism by valuing human beings based on their productivity, on their ability to perform according to punishing demands, to earn money, to be of use. By building this ecology, not only do we want to center and elevate lived experiences of disability in media art practice, but affirm that access is everybody's responsibility and a creative imperative to expand the horizon of artistic possibility. So I'll stop there because I've covered a lot of ground, but I really look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was incredibly inspired and inspiring. An incredible journey of the research and scholarship that you've done in the art and tech residency space, but also this sort of putting things into action on the ground within a community of care. Really, really excited to learn more as we invite the panelists from the Open Documentary Lab to come on and turn on your cameras. We're joined by panelists who are fellows around the world, but we're also joined by a few people who are back in our lab in person. And those people will probably have masks on. So that's how we can tell where people are these days. So yeah, I open up the floor to questions. Please, for the public, drop your questions in the Q&A box. And yeah, we've got quite a grid here. Please raise your hand in the panel if you have comments or questions for Vanessa. Richard.
Yeah, one of the things that's, now let me first of all preface by what I have to say, that my high point in technology was the rotary telephone. And I've been trying now to catch up as quickly as I can. But one of the things that struck me, and I'm coming out of a documentary film, which is, let's say, dealing with social and political issues. And one of the things that struck me about what you said, when you're talking about the utopian element of the 60s incorporated into your projects. I did a film on a very disabled man. It was for the Rockefeller Foundation. And the point of the film was to, in a sense, humanize a disabled person in a way to see that they can, in a sense, be very constructive and creative within society. Now, Hubert was visually somebody who looked very unappealing. He was in a wheelchair, couldn't use his legs, not very well shaven, 40 some odd years old. By no stretch of the imagination was he a poster person. And when I showed that to Easter Seals, they said, no, we can't use this, so forth. So I took the film, the foundation asked me what to do with the film. And I said, well, let's see what kids react to it. So to make a long story short, I took it to an area which had in Arkansas, this was in Arkansas, that had a mixture of kids from different class, different ethnic backgrounds, and we showed it to about 500, 600 middle school kids over a 3-day period. I was absolutely astounded. It was one of the great moments of my career with a letter. The only request I made was that they write a letter after they see it. They saw the human, they identified with Hubert, because Hubert had a goal that he wanted to get something in his life, which was a job, which he did get eventually as a greeter in McDonald's. But they connected that with their own lives. And that was kind of amazing, saying in effect, you know, I thought I had problems and I couldn't deal with them. And I saw Hubert and I realized, so forth. They formed a Hubert Club. They got a school bus, took them all the way to Little Rock. They met Hubert, they got his autograph and so forth. And this was, when you talk about your community that you did, it's a utopian community within itself. And I guess the question that I had in mind is, how do you extend that utopian vision? I mean, the point I was making in my film is that the film, which I didn't deliberately set out to do, but I discovered that the film drew people into a utopian, kids into a utopian vision of that they did not have before, by identifying with somebody who was struggling to deal with and to some degree overcome the difficulties he had in life. And by the way, he was the most spiritual person I ever met in my life. I never heard him complain, and nobody else ever heard him complain about anything. So anyhow, this is a long way of getting around to the question. So how can you draw those who are not members of that community, you know, into recognizing that utopian element that is always, in a sense, inherent in art and creation? Am I making sense?
I think so. It's a lot to unpack there. I would say, I mean, a key part of disability activism and advocacy has been working against emotions like pity, right? So that people and the disabled who are disabled don't want to be pitied; they want to be inherently valued as human beings. On the other side of that, you know, I mean, there's this kind of discourse about productivity and kind of fitting into society that is a pretty fraught one, right? It's how we think about like the usefulness of people and disabled bodies. I mean, the truth is, all of us are likely to be disabled at some point in time, perhaps temporarily, perhaps permanently. I think in terms of drawing people into that community, and part of the work that we're trying to do is to talk about kind of a disability aesthetics, right? And to kind of support a disability aesthetics and to invite a kind of experience of that artistic space that is not kind of grounded in pity or in opposition, right? That humanization is really about an invitation into the enormous capacity that that access allows. When we were doing the show, we had a number of works that were not confrontational, but an invitation to look differently, to understand what it means when like you have diverse abilities and how that can allow for different forms of artistic production. So I think it's about, I mean, there's an education aspect to it, like in really supporting disabled artists to create that work, but also to try and break open this idea that there's a particular kind of aesthetics that is especially beautiful, or this especially preferred, or that is that is against kind of what we think of as effective art. You know, one artist we were recently talking to has been developing camera and documentary tools that are tethered to his wheelchair. And it's really interesting when you look at his work, right? And you look at the film he's creating, there's a very different sensibility to it, because it's very much about his experience as a wheelchair user and how he sees the world and how he translates that into an artistic object. So I think it's about kind of resetting aesthetic paradigms and inviting people to participate in that.
Okay. By the way, just very quickly.
Sorry, Richard, we have a lot of questions, so we're just going to move on and then maybe get back to you later.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard. William, I think you had your hand up next. Oh, yeah, he's getting the mic.
Well, thanks. It was really terrific. You covered it in a very nuanced way.
Thank you. So I can't hear you very well.
You need to turn that mic on, William.
That's right. Okay. Any better? Yeah. So thanks for the nuanced lead through a very complex terrain. I really appreciate it. I guess the question I have, I was triggered. I'll use the word triggered by the kind of technology development graph. And I take your point absolutely that the arts can influence the developmental trajectory of technology. Absolutely. I don't really buy the argument that the arts buy in at the plateau of stability stage. And I'll tell you why. What I think that reveals is a kind of institutional bias. If by the arts, what we mean is who, at the moment at which Google establishes an arts center or Bell establishes an arts relationship, or when festivals perceive something and legitimize it, you're right. Absolutely. That's when we can see a lot of artists showing up. But, just the historian in me sort of says, actually, it's that stage. It's that prototyping stage before venture capital is even an idea, where you see some incredible innovation, including arts innovation. Problem is, it doesn't get into the books. It doesn't get, and so my question, I guess, is, if I'm right that there's kind of that institutional lens creates a bias, then the analysis we come up with about why change is happening or not happening is kind of rooted in those institutions. If we broaden our historical frame and look at artistic interventions, artistic uses of technology before the VCs hit it, right in the prototype stage, then we're going to ask a different set of questions. Why do those ideas get filtered out or sustained? But I think it's usually filtered out. So I just love to get your assessment of that, because you know this space better than I do, but that's my kind of instinctual read. Thanks.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you that artists do make that intervention at a much earlier stage. I didn't want to suggest otherwise. I think part of the issue in the United States is funding and access to that stage. I mean, typically when artists are invited or get access to these technologies, and it's particularly more the case now, or in this platform capitalism, that's where that happens. In our current moment, open source communities and open source platforms are where a lot more artists are making those kinds of interventions. And there are a number of different communities as well, even in corporate environments, where they're supporting that kind of work. So absolutely, yes, there is a history of innovation there. And that history is not completely erased or elided here. I moved through it very quickly. It's just very hard now to be able to have not just the funding at that space, but the funding to have an artistic practice where you can actually do that work. And that's why I think regenerative ecologies are very important, because we can sustain more support at that space. I mean, historically, there has been a lot of work and innovation there. Now it's very hard because of the kind of ebb and flow of capital to artists.
That's something you highlight very much in the GRID report, is the tension between industry, academics, and government support of these programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of will and there's a lot of interest, but how do you sustain a life doing this work? I mean, I think this is a really critical question here.
And who decides what gets funded at what stage?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely.
Halsey, up in your treehouse.
Yes. Thank you so much, Vanessa. This is wonderful. I am a white man with a black mask and a treehouse behind me. It's not really a treehouse. It's just branches with green leafy trees. It makes me think of spring. I have a question that sort of follows nicely from Williams, I think, or at least your response to Williams, is really about open source software, open source, other things in the sort of Crip community. I just wonder, you used the phrase platform capitalism, which I found very interesting and encapsulating of lots of ideas. And I'm wondering if open source software, et cetera, can sort of counter that to a certain extent, give artists more affordable, sort of choices of and more sort of durable choices in some senses. So I was really wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, the pros and obviously the cons as well. There are massive challenges with open source. As an open source developer myself, getting funding and all that to build these platforms and maintain them is very, very, very difficult. And you want to not go away. You want platforms to persist and all of that. So I was just wondering, is there a Crip open source community? Is this a thriving arena? If you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be really wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Open source is necessary, but hard. And I think part of the challenge is that when you have a tool like Unity, it's right there and you can use it, and it's so effective and it's so powerful. So it's just really sticky terrain. And I think organizations like Processing Foundation are working to support this kind of work. I mean, if we're looking at trying to support open source development, I mean, we have to think about people not as being alone doing that work by themselves, but building communities, open source communities that support that. I know Processing does consult with various communities, including disabled communities, in trying to develop their work and their platforms. Is there a Crip open source community? I mean, in a really kind of core philosophical sense, you could say that the work of cripping technology is kind of fundamentally open source, even if it's not exactly software. There is and has historically been a challenge with education for disabled folks to learn these kinds of tools. And it takes time, it takes investment. So, in a burgeoning way, yes, I think that there is a Crip open source community, but is it particularly robust and standing on its own? Not yet, and it's folded into kind of other open source communities that are doing this kind of work. But with all of this, I mean, that's why I talk about ecologies, right? I mean, we need these community infrastructures to support the kind of work and the kind of development that's happening in the space. And it can't just be disabled folks doing that work. We're all responsible in developing like education platforms for supporting people getting agency and doing that kind of work, in granting access to the hardware that's designed to do this work. I mean, one thing that was very troubling for us when we did our show was when we wanted to pay artists. We had artists who were like, you can't pay me right now because I have too much money in my bank account. And if you pay me, that will affect my benefits. Can you wait till this month and then you can pay me? So there's like real structural issues about how we conceive and support of disability, particularly in this country, that can make it very difficult for people to access even the most fundamental technologies to engage with this kind of work.
Artemis.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. And in the service of time, I want to just jump in on this kind of whole discussion of disability aesthetics. And I want to say how much I appreciate how much the works that you're showing pull out kind of the sensual dimensions of technology and help us to kind of rethink and remake things like, media art, this wider media ecology, how they can contribute to that. But I kind of want to pick up on this exchange that you just had with William, and especially about this disabled avant-garde. I'm wondering if you've come across artists and works that are kind of and groups of people who are working along the lines of subverting the technology and commenting on it and critiquing it, as well as kind of remaking it and widening the ecological sense of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a very core sense, that critique is embedded in the work that a lot of artists are doing. One of the artists we showed in our exhibition goes by the name Blink Pop Shift, designed a bespoke AI to serve as a prosthetic memory because they have a brain injury that makes it difficult for them to have long-term memory. So implicit in this is a kind of critique of contemporary ideas about memory and kind of memory storage and AI as a tool for that, and needing to really kind of develop a bespoke system to do it. So in that sense, I guess that would be something to relate to Stephanie Dinkin's second work, right? Not the only one, where it's not just about critiquing technology as such, but about creating alternative forms of that technology. We also showed work by Kinetic Light. Kinetic Light is an extraordinary disability, justice, and dance collective here in the Bay Area, whose leader, one of their leaders, Alice Shepard, is really kind of highly visible and active in the disability community. And so we showed a work by theirs called Revel in Your Body, which was this really joyful performance piece called wheelchair dance that was filmed on top of a parking lot in Atlanta. And they were using they actually had their wheelchairs, dancing in their wheelchairs up and down on trampolines and all over the environment, around stair railings. But the entire project was filmed with a phantom camera, which is typically used for, it's a high-speed camera that is typically used for like laboratory purposes and scientific purposes. So kind of implicit in that reclaiming of that camera for aesthetic purposes, it's trying to kind of conceptually reorient this idea that disabled bodies are there to be looked at in a scientific and medicalized way, and turning that technology of looking into something that can capture and express a different kind of movement through space and disabled joy. So I think there's a few ways that there's that engagement and critique with technology and kind of reorientation into what those technologies can do.
Right, and institutional critique as well of various industries, military, et cetera, I imagined.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Ellen, who is working with Vanessa on Cryptek Incubator, but also a fellow in our lab.
Yeah, Vanessa, I wanted to thank you for two things. One was the quote by Inka Shobe, which I didn't know about. And I was surprised because he doesn't use that much technology in his work. His work is about other things. So I was surprised to hear him make that discussion. And the second thing is I wanted to both counter what William said and bring it back to your curb cut Berkeley smashed sidewalk, which I also didn't know about. So what I found in running not just ThoughtWorks Arts, but Artihack and Volumetric Society, all of them, is that we begin in all of our aspects with an artist who has an idea that's usually not supported by anybody or almost anyone, because we're all circulating and we run into someone and we think that's a great idea and you're not getting any support. So we want to give you, especially at a base level, a little leg up. That little leg up, where there's no corporate interest, no sponsorship, no affiliation. I mean, this person or these people are sort of in the wild, just putting things together, is very close to that analogy that you mentioned about people smashing sidewalks. Mm-hmm. And I've seen it go many different ways past then. But the thing that I want to emphasize and what I think you're running into and what is strongly understood without the corporate grant funders, which come later for the big exhibitions and everything else, is artist owned, artist run at the baseline. Minimal resources. And that subverts, in my experience, although it also can enhance platform capitalism.
Mhm.
And it's very tricky because you can't ask the artist not to cash in on what they've done, because it's pretty rough for them and they need money. But I think in reference to what William said about, that the whole Gartner thing, this emergent work you're doing with CripTech, from what I saw of the show, and I was lucky enough to be in San Francisco to see the show, which is where I met you, because I was very moved by the show, is very close to the smashing of the sidewalk in Berkeley. And I sensed that very quickly. So I'd like to keep that as an analogy also for the smashed sidewalk with Inka Shobe's comment. And that is, at least for these type of projects, the earth upon which this kind of work walks, although it may go in many other directions beyond anyone's control or imagination. But I just wanted to say that before it gets to any of the big five. Are we feeding into the big five? Yes and no. I mean, that's complicated, but initial impulse, like your initial impulse for the show and initial impulse for CripTech, came from the smashed sidewalks of curb cut. So that was a wonderful analogy, and I really thank you for using that.
Thank you, Ellen. And yeah, as noted, Ellen is a partner with ThoughtWorks in the program, and it's been really extraordinary to sort of have this shared view about what our capacity is and what we can support in doing this kind of work. I think it's true that there's much smashing that needs to be done in this landscape, and this question of how we do not engage with the big five. I mean, you're right, it's very fraught. We should not deny artists the capacity to cash in if they want. They absolutely should do that. They need to. It may sustain their practice. We're really looking to build alternatives that are not just about like, here, make this thing, but how can we make this thing and support it and give it an engine and drive it and keep it going. And I think, one thing I'd like to highlight too is that we're in this really interesting moment when it comes to disability advocacy and activism. Just the last few years, there's been this incredible marshaling of energy around it. So we're really building on that work as well in this media art space.
There's a question in the chat from Silvina Fernandez, who asks about, they're wondering if they've heard correctly, technical design is applied philosophy. Is that correct? And also, can you share again the name of the program
Yes.
that places philosophers with R&D labs? Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that sort of early research and early conceptualization that perhaps is a little bit of that smashing of the concrete that Ellen
Right. Yeah, we can think about technical design as applied philosophy, because ultimately making technologies is about philosophizing what those technologies are and what they should do. So the program, that's kind of embedded in the history of technology and philosophers like Latour, but in the Berggruen Institute, which is somewhat recently founded, they've got a lot of different arms right now, publication, different programs, and now actually launching a school and a fully funded program over the next year, turns out, in the Bay Area, to do some interesting work at the intersection of art, technology, and philosophy. Tobias Rees runs Transformations of the Human, and one of the things that they do, among other things like fund art projects and publications in a school, is place artists, philosophers, teams at R&D labs and tech firms. When I spoke to him, I think they had 7 teams at Facebook. The teams at Facebook, the teams at Adobe, Google, and trying to create this crucible for developing technologies with these philosophical questions. So I can type that in for Berggruen Institute. Of the human.
Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of questions they're bringing to to those R&D labs?
You know, I think it really depends. They have these working groups together, and they've named, they originally started with different themes to address, but, you know, as I understand, it's been kind of a bit of a dance, right? Trying to find a shared language so that the invitation to continue to be at these labs is sustained. So the questions kind of come up, and they're really interested in, you know, artificial intelligence and how it transforms the human, and biotech, and interface design. So that's, I think it varies, right? Like in terms of they don't arrive, they have arrived with a set of kind of core interests, but the questions themselves are developed in conversation with these engineers. And also, one thing that Tobias really emphasized to me is that you can't talk at engineers, you've got to do with them. I mean, Ellen, I imagine you have this experience as well, right? So this is where that applied philosophy piece comes in. You're like, we're going to place you in these spaces and actually do. So I think initially they wanted to place PhDs, philosophy PhDs, but philosophy PhDs like to talk. So they had to really kind of scale back and think about people who could do in that philosophical way.
Making philosophers do and making engineers talk.
Yep.
This is another question about that spectrum of disability from Charity Everett in the chat, who's wondering if we can interpret the idea of disability to encompass those who are experiencing extreme emotional and spiritual distress, and how they process information that comes to them while under these influences. Is that, can you speak to that?
Well, one of the major kind of expansions and concerns we have with doing this work is ensuring that neurodivergence is included among the disability community, and people identifying as disabled, I think, is really central to this. Emotional health, I think, can be a part of that. While under the influence, how they process information. Well, while under these influences, sorry, not under the influence. Yeah, I mean, do you mean like depression and mental health? Is that the kind of framing that?
Maybe crises, like emotional, spiritual crises. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think that's a tricky question. I mean, if that's something that starts to shape your identity and experience of the world, then it sustains you, then that might be something that comes under the banner of disability. I want to say though, like, I do not want to be the arbiter of who is defined as disabled or not. I think a kind of crucial to the work we're doing is trying to get away from like a medicalized model of disability towards a cultural model to support disability solidarity. So that's something that, if it's, you know, disability is something that can be temporary, but we're also thinking about disability that's something that is produced by society, right? It's not something inherent to a person, but it's produced by the intersection of maybe structural and environmental barriers, whether that be stairs if you're a wheelchair user, maybe it's in a learning environment in schools, if you have a learning style or you're neurodivergent and that doesn't accommodate and make education accessible for you. So in that sense, that kind of social model of disability is how we're often thinking about it. Whether kind of spiritual or emotional crises come under that, I guess I would invite you to think about how much that might work, right? Is it about that kind of like misfit of the world as it's kind of designed and constructed by humans with your experience of the world? And to what degree disability solidarity and identifying with the disability community will support you in addressing that.
Thank you, Vanessa. Shelby Evergreen, a question about art as commodity. Do you think it's worth to frame art as a worthy, often consumed commodity? It's production question, so that capitalists can understand the value, or is it that counterintuitive to promote the inherent value of art, especially that by disabled artists who might be more limited in their ability to produce works?
Is it worthy to frame art as a commodity? This is an interesting question. I mean, artists need to live, artists need to eat, their work needs to be supported. Art is worthy. Should it be a commodity? I mean, it's sort of inherently valuable. I don't know, to me, this makes me think about the whole NFT discussion, which I find really
Let's do it.
Don't know if I'm ready for that. I mean, people should be able to sell their art. You know, it does have value. This is the world that we live in. I think that there's nothing worse than telling an artist they should just do something for exposure. You can't eat exposure. But I guess I would invite us to think about the larger frame of capital. Like how do we get everyone outside of that and find sustainable ways to and to create a world that not everything has to be commodified in that way. Art has inherent value, but it's certainly, you know, is something that people should find sustainable. I don't know. We could get into NFTs if we want. I don't know if anyone wants to engage in that discussion.
Nadav.
Hi, Vanessa. Good to see you again, and thank you. Thanks for this wonderful talk. I have a kind of superficial question, but I think it's an important one, just thinking of both educators that I imagine there are quite a few connected right now even to this talk, and emerging artists, just like where, other than your own project, other than Cryptek Incubator, do you have kind of places to point people towards that are willing to kind of, you know, immerse themselves in more of what's going on in terms of this approach to CripTech and open source technology coming, you know, from this group, and you know, both on the tech and the art side, basically, kind of, are there hubs or organizations or, you know, just kind of surveys or, you know, anything like that are kind of good places to start from?
You mean specifically art, technology, and disability?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's there need to be more. There aren't enough. There's been more of a shift this year. I know that IBEAM was launching a residency specifically for disabled artists and specifically for disabled artists of color. So they're kind of launching on that path. The Ford Foundation has been doing some of this work as well. They just have been developing, or this past year, they've had their Disability Arts Futures Fellows, where they supported 20 disabled artists doing this work. But I will say, when we talked to them in the early stage of our program design, very few kind of identified as media arts practitioners. So there really aren't a lot. It feels like a pretty fresh intersection, and there's kind of different pockets of people doing this work. When we, you know, in the applications we received for this program, it was surprising. I mean, we wanted, because we're funded by the California Arts Council, like, okay, let's see, like, try and support Californian artists. There are some, but it's like California, New York, a little bit of Midwest, a lot of Canadians. Turns out Canada is doing great support of this work at different kind of centers, but there's nothing that feels particularly well consolidated, I would say, yet. And so our interest in developing this program and the learnings we've already had in just this submission process is that there needs to be a better pipeline for disabled artists, and particularly disabled artists of color. There needs to be education opportunities. There needs to be more exhibition opportunities. There needs to be an elevation of curators in this space for disabled as well. But it's very patchwork. I would say, and people are very much seeking community. In a lot of the applications that we received, this was really headlined here, being like, I'm grateful for this program, even if you know, I'm not one of the fellows. Can you keep this going somehow? How can we do that? You know, and I think one thing that is really important too, because it's been really highlighted by the pandemic, how you know, some of us are pretty tired of these virtual engagements, but it's kind of created opportunities for community and access that many people haven't been able to experience. So that community really does need to be at minimum hybrid, right, to kind of reach people across the country. But there's very much an urgent need for it.
Ask you, Vanessa, can you talk a little bit about the learnings you've had so far in both developing this program, but also cripping it and cripping the infrastructures that you're working within?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what we did at the beginning of this project was just try and talk to people and listen. People developing residencies. We spoke to the folks at IBEAM, because they did an access residency a couple of years ago that was access kind of broadly conceived. We talked to the folks at the Ford Foundation, at Kinetic Light. You know, we wanted to really approach this with an intersectional lens. Like, we really want to elevate not just disabled artists, but disabled artists from diverse communities. And that's turned out to be a lot harder than we thought, right? Because it's one thing to say, hey, here's this residency, come do your work. How do they get to that point, right? Like, how do we mitigate some of these structural issues, not only in kind of STEAM education, but in the art and technology field? I mean, if you all had a look at the NEA study that came out this year, this is a field-wide issue as well, right? Like, how do we build that pipeline? So that's an issue. I think too, thinking about cripping timelines and this notion of crip time. So crip time, if you're not all familiar with, is this idea that, you know, it's kind of like against clock time and capitalist time. And through the pandemic, we've all had to kind of really be more acquainted with crip time, the time that it might be the time of illness, the time of flexibility, that you may not always be available when you're scheduled to be available because your body or mind is flexible and needs flexibility. So that's something, as we've tried to develop this program, like, oh, how do we not just reach people, but serve people and place that in kind of conversation with our own programmatic needs, right? We want people to apply. Can you please apply by this point? So then we can get to the next bit and we can get these people together to talk about it. So we've had to really have lots of open channels of communication between people to really meet them where they are and where their body minds are, which remains tricky for scheduling. In terms of access and kind of building accessible practices into virtual meetings and into submissions, that's been a huge learning as well. So when we have meetings, doing the kind of access check-ins that we did at the beginning of this one with visual descriptions, making sure there are interpreters. We've had a few fails, like we did this community meeting. Did the ASL interpreter completely screwed up the recording because we pinned too many people, so then it was less accessible. Captioning as a tool and the bias and inherent limitations of auto captioning and working with people to support that. Access is expensive and takes more time, whether you're doing that in artistic practice or whether you're doing it at a community level. At Kinetic Light, the Kinetic Light does this workshop and they say, well, access takes 30% more time. That is a significant amount of time, actually, 30% more time. So really trying to be present for people and give them the space they need, and also having to, I mean, I know personally, I tend to overwork and I tend to try and be available all the time, and I tend to try and hit all my calendar marks. So it's been a real kind of lesson in self-compassion as well, I think, and trying to understand how ableism is not just bad for disabled folks, but kind of for all of us, you know, and the kind of expectations that it places upon us to produce. Other learnings that it's that disabled communities are incredibly generous and incredibly hungry for this kind of work. They're hungry for community and generous with their time, and looking to support this work. That accessibility can mean a lot of different things, that thinking about practices to serve, I mean, we talk about the curb cut and the curb cut effect, but designing for neurodivergence in meetings means kind of like building in certain kinds of breaks or having agendas at the top of the meeting. These things are just useful to do for everyone. So that's another learning. But I think, for us, it's really the most eye-opening thing has been the need, right? And the need to build this pipeline and the incredible interest that people in the media arts community have in doing this work. I mean, I've been a little overwhelmed at how many people are like, yeah, me too, how can I be part of this? And we need more money and we need more bandwidth, we need more time. And like, it's sometimes, I mean, I talk to Lindsay and our other collaborators at Leonardo, and she'll be like, yes, CripTech world domination. But it seems like there's real space for that right now. So yeah, I guess some of these are the core learnings that we've had, like from the small, and that I've kind of inculcated into my life and into my practice, to the really large sense of like what these gaps are and what we really need to do, and the will of people to support it. I think that's been really gratifying as well.
Thank you, Vanessa. One last question from Sarah. She's just getting the mic.
Is it on?
Not right now.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this talk and this work. It's really, really inspiring. And I guess just a question about education. It is an emerging field, and I look at like our lab, and when we started, and there was so much education that needed to happen for people to even think about how they could contribute to the field, or to funders, how they could fund it, or institutions, how they could support it. Can you talk a little bit about the educational initiatives, education initiatives that you do to sort of build this ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we've kind of thought about education in a few different tiers of the project. We've with our partners, there's been so much interest and will in participating, and so we want to kind of foreground. We want to foreground access as our commitment, and something that can continue informing these various sites as they go along. So we've been doing work with like educating people and having information about disability justice, advocacy, and language, and practices. We have an amazing advisor, Claudia Alec, who supports us with program design and accessibility, and she does a lot of work at the beginning of beginning of meetings to create a space where if people create what she calls ouch moments, that there is a space to kind of safely address that and grow together. So at a very kind of ecological network sense, that's some of the work that we're doing. In terms of the bigger picture, I mean, we haven't yet started on this, but we want to create educational platforms. We are planning to do this with Leonardo's partner, Arizona State University, and actually having a course that through which we can develop and kind of really frame these aesthetic access paradigms in media art. We're also looking to work with Gray Area, based in the Bay Area, to do education among media artists led by disabled artists. So kind of really supporting disabled artists to support innovation in that space. So yeah, lots of different layers and tiers, I think, that we're trying to do this work. I mean, for me, it's every day is a new learning experience as well.
Thank you, Vanessa. Yeah, I think what really strikes me from the conversations we've been having and from what you were saying is that the history of disability gives contour and shape to the history of technology. It's really at the core of what you're developing and bringing out into the world. So we really appreciate your time to share this incredible journey that you and your community are on. Thank you so much. We're out of time, but I wanted to thank you for this wonderful talk. Thank you to all the panelists and all the public for coming. Please join us next week for a talk by Marissa John and Rafi Segal, who will talk about their co-created project, an emergent tech project called Care House. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you.